really appreciate that we've got the Zoom tonight because I think we have probably 3 or 4 times as many people on Zoom this evening than in person. We're going to dive in here in a minute, and I'm going to take you on a ride through the world of mushrooms. And couple things, if you can't hear me, and if you're on Zoom and you have difficulty hearing me, just type it into chat and Em will alert me, because sometimes I can tend to get quiet. And particularly in the room, it's a little harder on Zoom. If I'm rambling on to something and you say, tell me more, or you want to ask me a question about it or challenge me, that's even better. Please go ahead and do that. If you're an introvert, you can raise your hand. If you're an extrovert, just say. Em will be monitoring the chat with any questions that come through, and if they're relevant to the moment, she'll ask me, and we'll wait. And at the end, we're gonna do some questions as well. And so I'm gonna dive in. And for me, I want to start with from the very first time even before I ever started playing with mushrooms, to me, it's all about getting in nature. It's all about getting out into the woods, and when I was growing up, out into the desert. And being in that sense of quiet. I grew up in a small house with 5 children, all of us kind of bundled together in age, and if I wanted to get quiet, I had to get away. And so that's what I did a lot growing up. And when I was, the year I turned 16, I spent the summer in upstate New York. And that is where I got interested in mushrooms, that first year. Because in the desert, up in the mountains, the right times of year, you find mushrooms, but in general, not like Maine. So about 50 years ago, last year, I bought my first mushroom book when I was still a teenager, and I have been deep down in that in so many ways for so many years. So that's what you'll get the benefit of some of that learning as we go through today. And other than nature, what really drove me early on was wanting to eat mushrooms. What are the mushrooms that I can collect on my own and cook up and eat? And early on, I didn't know anybody else that was doing mushrooming. In fact, about 5 or 10 years after I began, my mother told me that growing up on the ranch in Montana as a kid, she would collect mushrooms with her mother, my grandmother. Never told me that early on. So I was learning on my own, and so my learning curve was just way shallow. And presentations like this will help your learning curve a lot, and we'll talk about other options as well. So, to me mind, and this Pha Pachak is a Vietnamese poet, and he says, the forest makes your heart gentle. You become one with it. No place for greed or anger there. And that for me is kind of climbing into the woods. It's that time of quiet. For about most of the past 30 years, most of my professional work was in suicide prevention, mental health, suicide response after a loss, and my gardens and my mushrooms were really important in terms of that balance in my life, and that's what I still use. So we're going to dive in, and we're going to spend a few slides just kind of looking at the wonder of mushrooms, because that's what struck me that first summer in upstate New York. The colors, the mystery, the shapes, the architecture, and it just caught my imagination. And many people who don't know mushrooms think, oh, mushrooms, they're kind of brownish, right? And they're every color of the rainbow, every shape of the rainbow. This false morel on that left-hand side there, which is in Maine a fairly common spring mushroom, just looks like a brain. And we won't even talk about what the one on the right-hand side, the dog stinkhorn, it's called a Mutinus canis, and it looks very much like a well-developed dog penis. And unlike most mushrooms, this group does not use the air to spread its spores. That very end of its pink tip becomes this foul-smelling goop when it's mature. And it spreads its spores by attracting flies and other insects to eat it up and poop it out other places. So tons of different shapes and colors we'll go through. These ones in the deep forest on a rainy day, you really can tell why this one is called the varnish conch, hemlock varnish conch. If you're into medicinal use of fungi, it's also called the reishi or lingxi, very well known for 5,000, 6,000 years as a medicinal aid in China, Japan, and now here. Yeah. And colors all over the place. The painted bolete on the left there is rarely common, particularly in a somewhat dry year in the summer. And the right one there, the lilac-gilled Laccaria, gorgeous. Almost bone gray on the top when it's in dry weather. Then you turn it over and you see this gorgeous color of the gills. And these ones, they call this the wine cap stropharia, and they get 6 inches across. And these two were photographed in my backyard. I have raised beds and I have wood chips between them. I inoculated the wood chips with the mycelium of this mushroom, and they would fruit in the beds early in the summer and then late summer and into the fall. An interesting edible, not my fave, but well worth playing with, easy to grow. And every year now for the past 13 years, I spend a week up in Washington County at Eagle Hill Institute. And we have a 5-day seminar my friend Mike Lean and I teach. We call it Mushroom Camp. And this gorgeous kind of, remember, who's old enough here to remember the dreamsicles that you get in, yeah, we all are, I guess, good. And that color, that kind of orange cream sickle, that's what these looked like. And there was an arc that covered about half the width of this room in the woods, just with these one that young stage, and the underside is just covered with little teeth, and that's how it drops its spores. It's a hidden ellum. Not edible, but boy, it looks like it should be, huh, at this age. Yeah. And this one's got a great name. They call this the bloody court. If you're into the Latin, it's Cortinarius semisanguineus. So it's actually true, would be called the somewhat bloody court. There is one called the sanguineus, it's even darker red, but the color on this is gorgeous. And some people are into dyeing fabric with mushrooms, and this one is one of the mushrooms that I dry and save for some friends of mine that use them in that way. And I don't know what to call this. They call this the orange peel cup, Illyria aurantiaca, and I put the photograph of the red eft, which we see sometimes in the woods here, just the same color, not the same size.
I like the salamander above that.
Yeah, that's called the red eft, and they're a stage of a newt that's just incredible. I only seen them a handful of times, but they're here in Maine, yeah. And this is, the mushroom is a cup fungus. And like most cups, it's a group of mushrooms that they explosively release their spores when they're ready. And one way you can trigger them is to bend down and just breathe across the surface of it. And you see this little cloud of spores come up, thousands of them. And one day at the Botanical Garden in Booth Bay, they had moved around a bunch of stuff, and there was some of this fruiting on the sides of these hills near the parking lot, and there were hundreds of these. And I spent an hour and a half or so trying to trigger in them and the time to catch a photograph. It was before I had video on my phone. Yeah, fun. And then golden spindles, really common in moist areas along the edges of bogs in the summer and early fall. Edible, not incredible. And this guy, you know, that electric blue, there's no filter on this. It has this silvery blue top, but when you break it or cut it, it's got this bright blue latex inside. It's a milk cap. It's edible, and if you ever want to play a fun game, particularly with young people who are into Dr. Seuss, when you cook these, the blue turns green. So you could make your own green eggs and ham. Yeah. I don't find it often enough. So that's the mystery, that's the wonder, that's what grabs our imagination. And then, if like me, you start to say, are any of those edible? Then it kind of changes your attitude. You have to get serious. It goes from the wonder to the, I wonder if it's going to poison me. And I remember, you know, particularly since I was learning alone, that learning curve was mushrooms that I ate. And I ate a puffball the first time ever, 1978. I don't, you know, they're good. Some of them are excellent, actually. And then I had a wild version of the meadow mushroom, the supermarket mushroom. And then the third one was that shaggy man you were talking about, Steve. Yeah. But it was over like 3 years 4 years, 4 different mushrooms. And the concern is, am I going to sicken myself? And there are mushrooms out there that can and do kill people. And there's a whole lot of mushrooms which will make you wish you were dead for a certain time-limited length of time as you worship at the porcelain bowl, as we say. And there are some people, that say, you should never eat wild mushrooms because it takes someone with a PhD, an expert, to be able to tell the difference between an edible one and a poisonous one. And in some groups, and I'll show you one in a minute, that's true. But we're going to learn about the ones that are easy to identify, the more or less foolproof ones. And that same attitude comes to the idea of, all right, what's a mushroom and what's a toadstool? Now, toadstool is a word that was coined by the Brits, who were famous for fearing mushrooms. And it's any mushroom, I don't know if it's good to eat, so it must be a toadstool. And I got this toad to pose beside this toxic Amanita one year as a toadstool. And then more recently, there's an incredible artist named Beatrix Cromwell, who did a whole series of toadstool drawings. And she has a couple of posters that are available on Etsy. Each one of those is a frog of a sort. Some of them are edible frogs and some of them are not edible frogs. So America, for a long time, even though we are a melting pot from many cultures where mushrooms have always been eaten, we have grown to fear mushrooms. I lived in a kind of mixed background home. My mother was French and German. And her mother, we used to collect the mushrooms on the ranch in Montana, and my German grandfather was okay with that. My father was Irish. He would not let a mushroom into the house. My mother would sneak mushrooms into the tuna noodle casserole. In the cream of mushroom soup, remember that? Yeah. That's about the only mushroom that ever got in the house until I got older. And that sense of distrust embedded this culture for a long time. And boy, it's changing so rapidly over the past, really, 20, 25 years, but even more so over the past dozen years. And so if you grow up in that mycophobic, and that's a term coined by this guy named, and it's a couple actually, Gordon Wasson and Anna Pavlona Wasson. And he was raised in Montana and became a banker, and she grew up in the Ukraine and moved to this country as a pediatrician. And they met, fell in love, got married, and on their honeymoon in the Catskills, he tells a story of them walking down this forest path and her leaving his side and rushing to these mushrooms and calling them endearing Russian and Ukrainian names and gathering them up. As he says, what are you going to do with those? Well, we're going to cook them for dinner. No, you'll kill us. And that they began this long, decades and decades of journey, recognizing the difference in the cultures where they grew up. He grew up, well, it's poisonous. Don't touch it. You can't determine what's an edible mushroom. And she grew up learning the names with her ABCs and her numbers and collecting mushrooms with her family. And so she was in that mycophilic culture, mushroom loving. And in her world, and this is her quote, she said, when we were naughty, our mother would punish us by forbidding us to go mushrooming. How many of your mothers did that? Yeah, none of them, right? From Pishvin, Russian, he says, the fallen leaves are smelling like spice cakes, and the white mushrooms, the Boletus edulis, are uncommon, but if you find them, you pounce on them like a black kite, and you cut them off, and you remember that you promised yourself not to cut them off right away when you saw them, but to admire them first. And again, I promised myself, and again, I forgot. And I can so relate to that excitement of seeing something that's so desirable, and and for me, it's, I want to photograph it before I cut them, but sometimes I don't. And then from the Japanese, the haiku, my voice becomes the wind, mushroom hunting. Yeah. So that's that world. So China, Japan, some of the Malaysia, Indonesia, the Central Highlands of Mexico, a lot of Central and Eastern Europe. Those are cultures that love mushrooms. In fact, if I get home on time tonight, there is a a presentation on the area of Oaxaca, Mexico, and the mushrooming there and the culture that I'm going to take advantage of. It's on Zoom through the North American Mycological Association. Yeah. So I wrote a book about 15 years ago, and I have it here. And the title of that book is Chanterelle Dreams and Amanita Nightmares. And this photograph, when I found these mushrooms together, growing about 10 feet apart up in Hancock County, it kind of embodies that. Because the chanterelle, that's that hope. You know, the most popular edible in this state, and probably in New England, you know, that everybody seeks out. And the deadly destroying angel. So the nightmare of what could happen if you eat this mushroom by mistake. And I've talked to people who have, who survived, and apparently it tastes good for a while. Yeah. So that's what we're going to dive into. How do you figure it out? Because like I said, there are some groups of mushrooms where it really does take an expert with a microscope and a Ouija board to determine the different species. So this is a group of maybe 8 or 9 different red russulas that are common in Maine. A couple of those are edible, a couple of them we don't really know, and one of them is called Russula emetica. It'll go, it triggers vomiting. Yeah. So how do you tell the difference? And there are a bunch of mushrooms that are like this. And they're the groups, even if there are mixed in among them edible ones, why bother? I don't eat those. Yeah, and we'll talk more about that later. So how do we dive in? Back in 1943, there was a mycologist in Minnesota. He was at the University of Minnesota, Gordon Wasson, no, wrong, Clyde Christensen. And he wrote a book called Common Edible Mushrooms. I still have 2 copies of it, actually. And in that book, and his whole idea was, I want people to begin to take advantage of the wild mushrooms in their area, in their fields, in their yards, in the forest. And he had a chapter. It was called the Foolproof 4. And for Clyde Christensen, the foolproof mushrooms are common in your area. They're easy to identify, and they don't have any or many toxic lookalikes. And for him, there were 4 mushrooms that he included in the Foolproof 4. Morels, all in the genus Morchella, yellows and blacks. The sulfur shelf, which we typically call the chicken mushroom these days, or chicken of the woods. The puffballs, and for Clyde Christensen, he said, you know, any puffball, if when you cut it open, it's firm and pure white on the inside, go for it, it's edible. And the last one is the shaggy mane, or lawyer's wig, as they call it in Britain. And we're going to talk about those as we go along. But early on, as I began to do education, I said, well, Foolproof 4, doesn't seem enough. There are so many more mushrooms that fall into this category of easily identifiable, common, good edibility. Should we do a nifty 9 or a sumptuous 7, you know? And over time I said, you know, what my goal is to teach people, if you're going to begin foraging mushrooms, develop what in your area is a foolproof few. Mushrooms that grow where you're tromping in the woods that fit this criteria. And I'm going to we're going to go through about 10 different in that category. I rarely do we find that. It's really, really uncommon here, that one. There's a couple others. There's one a little more common in the fall, Mesenterica, which is edible, but yeah, not that one. But so we're going to dive into this. And this is really quickly the snapshot of a list. And in these, I probably will not talk about the lobster mushroom. And that's because A, I don't think it's that good. And B, I've dealt with some sickenings with it that I'm still trying to work out. But we'll talk about the rest of these and a couple more as we go through. And we are not going to talk about eating the white-lipped snail, the largest native land snail in North America. Rarely seen, but very common in our forests. It's nocturnal for the most part. Yeah. But we're going to talk. So over time, First time has been probably 20 some years ago. And then more recently, the first year of the pandemic, I did some surveys of people, on my mailing list and then a little more broadly. And I wanted to find out what people ate for wild mushrooms, how many they ate, how long they've been doing it, a few other odds and ends, where they get their education. And both times I did the survey, the golden chanterelle was by far the most frequently collected and eaten. And these were Maine people and New England people for the most part, some from further afield. And it's a good reason that it's widely eaten. It's common. We have a couple of related species, all interchangeable. They're all, relatively common in different forest types. They're easy to identify. We're going to talk about one toxic lookalike, but by and large, they're clear and distinctive, and they're yummy. How many people here have collected and eaten chanterelles? And on the Zoom, I'm assuming you're raising your hand. Yeah, many people. It's early on, particularly up in this part of the world, and they, the taxonomy, like with so many mushrooms, are being thrown up. But so what we used to call by the European name Cantharellus cibarius is now more likely Cantharellus annalensis in a couple. But it's really clearly golden color, golden yellow, not orange. And it's the same color, the cap top, the underside where the rough gills are, and the stem, all that warm yellow. And they grow scattered across an area in troopings, but never in dense clusters. You may find 2 or 3 together, but typically, they're scattered. And there's a couple species with that warm yellow, and every now and then, I find white ones mixed in. And the first few times I said, oh man, this is some strange other species. And we've learned now, it was great, the work on it was up in Newfoundland. And they determined that there's this point mutation that prevents the chanterelles from forming the color yellow. And so they come out clear white. And the ones in this photograph on the bottom there come from this area in the woods outside of Augusta, where I've been finding in this one area that's maybe about the size of this portion of the room behind me, where there are often 20, 30, 40, 50 chanterelles blooming, fruiting. There's a little patch of white ones. And I've eaten them a couple times. They're not as tasty. I think something about that gene that is not active also adds to the flavor. So don't worry about them. Yes?
On the previous slide, it said that they exist symbiotically with trees.
Yeah.
Is there any particular type of tree that you look for?
That's an excellent question. So symbiotically, so they grow mycorrhizally. There's 2 really broad growth types for mushrooms. Many of them rot things. They're saprobic, but there's a whole lot that partner with trees or shrubs. And chanterelles, it's kind of a generalist. The ones that I find that, actually this one and most of the ones on the slide before were with white pine, or white pine and hemlock. But there's others that grow under birch, and there's a variety I'm going to show you in a second that I find mostly under oak and beech.
Do you have that knife with you? I'm just curious. The knife is the perspective on the size.
You're gonna make me cry, because I lost that knife about a year ago, and it was my dress knife. I did photographs with it, and I know the forest it is, but I have not been able to find it. Yeah. So with chanterelles, oftentimes, mushrooms seem to come up all at once all together. Chanterelles have a fruiting period. They start usually around early July, and so long as there's adequate rain, they'll keep fruiting, sometimes well into October and even November. And when you find them, that patch that I was talking about, I'm going to find little tiny nubbins just starting, and mixed in them some that are totally mature, like the ones on the top right up there. And they're all going to be mixed together.
What have they gone by?
That's a really good question. Some people say I only like them when they're really young because that's when they're most tender. But all of the ones on this photograph are fine. If you'll see the edge of the margin of the cap is starting to go kind of dark yellow or brownish, that means they're starting to break down. Yeah. If it doesn't look good, it isn't good.
Okay.
And this is the one you need to learn. So I've had people text me or call me and say, Greg, I found this huge cluster of chanterelles. And I say, no, you didn't. Don't eat them. This is the jack-o'-lantern. And it grows as a parasite or saprobe around, usually from the heartwood or major roots of an oak tree, occasionally other species, but mostly oak. So you find it on the ground around the base of the tree in these dense clusters. Like the one on the left there, they're probably 75 caps. And each one, it's a little young. They were 2 to 3 inches in diameter. And the top right there was just outside of Lincolnville Center. And there were a bunch of them around this tree. And this is a mushroom where it's orange, not yellow. It has true gills, not the blunted gills of a chanterelle. And in a really dark room when they're young, the gills glow in the dark, bioluminescent, hence the name jack-o'-lantern. And if you eat them, like 5 to 7 hours of really severe nausea, vomiting, it's unpleasant. Yeah. So the reason, yes?
I was wondering if you could go back one frame to see the gills in this one.
Yeah. So these ones, you can see it particularly on the top and the ones underside, they're thicker. They're not the knife edge typical gill at all. Okay. And so most people say they're blunted gills or gill-like folds. Yeah.
Yeah, it has wrinkles in it.
Yeah. And they also fork a bit. Whereas, yeah, both of them will run down the stem, but they're a little decurrent. Yeah. And so if you put them together in the same slide, you've got the warm yellow chanterelles and you've got the orange jack-o'-lanterns, and you can see they're coming from a cluster fused together at the base. If you ever saw them together, you would never make that mistake. Yeah. And we have a bunch of smaller chanterelles, some of them called chanterelles, some of them not. The ones that are hollow all the way through are in a different genus. This is the trumpet chanterelle. And if you're from Sweden or some parts of Scandinavia, they'll say, yeah, those golden chanterelles, they're okay, but these are wonderful. They've got a richer flavor. And we have a couple of species that fit into this, the trumpet chanterelle, and the one on the left here is called the yellowfoot chanterelle. But they're also quite tasty. And the ones in the top there, that's a chanterelle, true chanterelle, it's phasmatus. This is the one that grows with oak trees. And it gets bigger. You know, sometimes I find them just about 4 inches in diameter. Same flavor, really nice. I have a couple forests where they grow really well in. I will not tell you where. Yeah. And also in that same family is the black trumpet. And the black trumpet, very good. And the second most popular collected and eaten wild mushroom in this part of the world. And I really thought, particularly it was well behind the chanterelles the first year, neck and neck the 20 years later. And I think if more people found and ate these, it would be number one. And yet they're not as predictable or as plentiful unless you get the right rainfall period. And then, whew, yeah.
That's why.
Yeah. So if it's a really abundant rainfall, that's what triggers them, and you get a summer like that. Even I've had years where I didn't see any at all until mid-October, and then we had a bunch of rain, and they came. And they grow, they love oak trees, oak and beech, oak and beech and hemlock, moist areas. And the first time you find them, stop. Say a thankful prayer to whatever god or goddess, and then slow down and look around the area. My son, Dashiell, had kind of gotten off of mushroom foraging for a while, and then he said, Dad, I want to get back into mushroom foraging. Can we go out together? And we went into this forest about 10 miles from here, where I knew black trumpets had been found. I hadn't found them before that. And we went, and it was the right time of year, and we were probably a good mile in, and Dash found the first clump beside the trail. And in that area down below, about 75 yards away, It was, I call it mushroom heaven, or black trumpet heaven. There were so many in there, and we took probably 10 pounds, 12 pounds home, and no one would have ever known that any of the mushrooms had been disturbed. There were so many left behind. Yeah. So abundant rains, their flavor is incredible. You know, chanterelles are good, but they have a mild, gentle flavor. Cream sauces, butter, eggs, chicken, white fish, that kind of thing. Boy, black trumpets go with everything. Last week, I made I've been thinking about making a meatloaf, which I hadn't made much for years. And so I had a group of men coming over to my house to do something. And so I made a meatloaf for them with black trumpets and porcini inside, and then a black trumpet gravy over the top of it with mashed potatoes. Pardon? Yeah, I dry them. They dry wonderfully. And so you get a good year like that year when they're all over the woods, you dry as many as you can and you keep them sealed or in glass jars and they'll last for years. Yeah. And there's a couple that are lookalikes. Don't worry about them. They're also edible and you're hardly ever going to find them. I was out on Hurricane Island this past late summer, and there was this family that joined us at the last minute with a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old who initially were so shy they didn't say a thing, and by the end of the weekend were all over the place. And they were the first ones to find these little black trumpets growing with the spruce up there, which I had never seen before. Yeah. So this is what they look like. They're called black trumpets, but often they're kind of grayish brown, and if it's been a dry period, the spores are ochre colored and they almost kind of get a little orangish gray, kind of beautiful color. Yeah. Very distinctive. They often grow in clusters. If they're mature, you can smell them in the woods around you. They have a strong, wonderful odor. Rose says yes. Yeah. And here you find them easily if they're coming up through moss, and much more challenging, they hide well among the leaves. And cooking these guys, they go with everything. You can put them on top of a pizza. If you do a slow grilled cheese sandwich with black trumpet in, you want them slow because you want the mushroom to cook. They're wonderful. And the one real danger, gluttony. I have a woman I know who started out taking classes with me, and she got very passionate about black trumpets. And she had a couple places where in a good year she found a lot of them. And she ate them 3 meals a day. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. She told me, and not a little bit, Greg, I ate a lot of them. And on the 3rd day, she started getting diarrhea. And she stopped eating them, but that diarrhea persisted for 10 days. She was getting really worried. So beware of gluttony. Yeah. We're going to go to a whole different group for the next one. They're called sweet tooth or hedgehogs. And I'm going to talk about a couple different varieties. And under that cap are these little stalactite teeth where the spores are born. And they grow in the woods. This Hydnum repandum, it likes mixed forests. I find them with oaks and mixed oak and hemlock. And they get sometimes 4 to 6 inches in diameter. Often they are very much peach colored or a little bit paler, and sometimes you find there's a couple closely related species that are pure white, all of them edible. And they have a lovely, gentle flavor, kind of like a chanterelle flavor, but they're crunchy. When you cook them, they keep this crunch texture. I like that. Midsummer into the early fall. They will grow in clusters sometimes, particularly I find them in a little bit grouping and sometimes partially fused together in hemlock forest, but not always. Yeah. And then related to that is another one which usually doesn't get more than 2 inches. Hydnum umbilicatum and a couple related species, like the one on the right here that's pure white, which they've been doing some taxonomy on this work, and I was finally able to assuredly identify that, and it's edible too. And the umbilicatum, there's a number of really closely related species, but the most of them you'll find is under hemlock starting September and October. And you look for those about the same time you're looking for matsutake if you get really adventurous. Yeah. And here's Steve's favorite mushroom. This is the 3rd mushroom I ever ate. on the campus of the University of New Mexico late in the fall, like the end of October into November. Underneath, there was a place where they took out a big cottonwood tree, a poplar. And this would fruit for 3 years running from the roots that were buried. And it's so distinctive. It's a saprobe, it's rotting stuff. And it comes up as a little kind of bullet or missile-shaped mushroom, and it grows bigger and taller, but it doesn't change that shape. And as it matures, it's one of the inky caps. It starts to melt into an inky mess. And I have places where I've found this, and it'll fruit really, really heavily for 2, maybe 3 years, and then I have to find another place because it has used up the dead material that is growing on. But when it's found, when it loves disturbance, where people have been moving stuff around and burying wood or other vegetation material, like this was the lawn in front of the Machias Savings Bank in Rangeley, Maine. And that was a very small portion of all the ones that were growing on that lawn that day. So if you find them, you want to collect them to eat when they're young, before the gills have started to turn black. And once they start to turn black, if it's a lean year, I'll wait and I'll cut off the darkening part and I'll cook up the rest. But I like them when they're a little bit younger and firmer. And the flavor is lovely. They make an incredible mushroom leek, potato leek soup. In fact, the recipe is in that book over there. I try and make that every year. And this is one warning with these. If you collect them and you bring them home in your basket, cook them that same day. Because that incanization, that's my word, will go on even in your refrigerator. If they're really young, they may keep a couple of days, but as they start to get middle age at all, they quickly will melt. Some people, more adventurous than I, will make a squid ink pasta out of the ink. I don't care. But they're a really lovely flavor. And there's one that's related to this. Sometimes you'll find literature that says, beware of the shaggy mane, because if you drink alcohol with them, you'll get sick. And there's a related species, the Tippler's bane, which doesn't look like him at all, closely related genus, where that's true. If you drink alcohol with it, or maybe even up to 72 hours after, you get what's called an anabuse reaction. Other than that, they're totally edible. So which is the toxin? The mushroom or the alcohol? Yeah. So here's some. The gray or the tan ones on the left there were pushing out from this really hard, packed roadside soil in Rockport one day. But you can see where you cut those open, those gills have already started to begin to melt. It's pretty common, this one, in the late spring, early summer, and then in the fall. And I think this was the third most popular, third or fourth on my list. This is called the hen of the woods. In the Midwest, they call it the sheep's head. If you find it cultivated, or the Japanese name for it is maitake, the dancing mushroom, Grifola frondosa. And this is another saprobe. It grows around the base of an old oak tree or an old ash tree, sometimes a beech tree. And it's rotting, its mycelium is rotting the heartwood, and it fruits typically from the ground. And you get these clusters, average maybe 8 inches across. I've seen them 24 inches across or so. And they are little spoon-shaped divisions that have these tiny pores underneath. Hen of the woods. And on a big tree, and I'll show you in a second, you can get a number of clusters that are fruiting at the same time. And I begin to find or look for these if we get a cold snap at the end of August, then, but usually not until early to mid September if there's rain. And then, I have a friend who said, I'm going to run my hen trap line. He had all these trees that he would check, and that's what I do. Because if you find this fruiting on a tree, don't forget where that tree is, because it'll fruit for years. The first one I ever found, I can't remember for sure, it was either 1982 or 1983, just outside of Camden. And that tree is still occasionally pushing out a hen of the woods. Yeah, it's pretty weak at this point, but still alive. So it's a great edible, robust flavor. It's a good medicinal as well. They started into the clinical trials to use it as an anti-cancer drug. But I don't think they couldn't see a way to make enough money with it. And so they didn't pass the phase 1 trials.
The colors can vary a little bit.
Yeah, and the colors can vary. You know what makes them vary? Sunlight. It's just like it's a melanin reaction. If you I found one time fruiting under a big section of birch bark. It was almost completely white. And I found them out in the open, and they're very dark, almost charcoal gray. Yeah, all about the amount of light they have. So on the top there is a young one, who's about 5 inches across, and that was up in Lincolnville. And that tree was a huge tree, which is gone now. And there were 23 clusters coming up that day. And this was out in the woods outside of Gardner, in a place where I know they grow. I had to hike in, and you can see them around the base of this tree. You can see them around the base of the tree behind it, and there were about.
Once the tree dies, it stops flowering.
After the tree dies, it'll continue to fruit for a few years, but it's not going to be getting a new bounty of fresh wood. Yeah. So in the right year, they come a lot. And you'll find them, as I said, from about the 1st of September. And the last ones, typically when you get a really hard frost, end of October. And, they're young, they're firm. You need to cook this because you can't digest it. It's not toxic. But I had a neighbor of mine get sick after I'd given her one, and she just started breaking off the pieces of it as she went through her day and eating it. And she just couldn't tolerate it. So our bodies have a way of doing that. Great in stir fries and soups and stews. You can dry it, but then you should want to powder it because it's quite leathery. And it's great partially cooked and frozen. And another really popular, really broad group called the oyster mushrooms, easily cultivated. We see them at the store all the time. And this is one in Maine. We have 3 common species that take you through most of the year, or most of the warm year. In the spring, you find the oyster mushrooms, and through the early part of summer on aspen. And it's now a different species called the aspen oyster. And then you find another one in the middle of the summer, the hottest time of the year, so long as there's rain, and it grows maple, birch, occasionally some other things. And then in the late fall, this is what it looks like, growing mostly on maples, sugar maple especially. And it grows very aggressively, breaking down the wood of the tree. So on this tree, there were probably 30 pounds on that tree that day, and it would probably fruit again for 2 more years, and then it would have exhausted what it could grow. And I knocked on that door. This was outside Hope, Maine, and I drove by and I saw it, and I pulled up and said, and the guy answered the door, and I said, "Hey, I don't know if you've noticed that huge, massive oyster mushrooms on the tree out there. Do you mind if I take some photographs and maybe take some home for dinner?" And he said, he looked at me like I had 3 heads. He said, "Sure, go ahead." And he was walking down his path, he said, "Save some for me." As if there would be a problem with that. Yeah. They have a nice flavor and texture. And I like them this age, when they're young and still a little bit rolled under, they're the best texture. When they open up fully, they get softer. And the ones that grow in the summer, you have to chase the bugs to them in the middle part of the summer. Later in the year, very few. They're most common the end of October into November for the late fall one. And they're also really excellent medicinally. If you've got high cholesterol or blood lipid profile that doesn't look really healthy, eat more oyster mushrooms. And I'm never suggesting that you toss out your statins. That's not my training, but do eat more oyster mushrooms. Yeah. And they're easy to cultivate as well. Probably one of the easiest to cultivate at home. And this guy, who's here has gotten really fascinated with the lion's mane as a medicinal aid. As a kind of fine-tune your brain. It has a compound in it that stimulates the production of what's called nerve growth factor. So it helps with nerve damage and growth, and also helps with mild dementia. So everybody's gotten really excited about it, particularly as you get to be a certain age. Keep your brain tuned. And here we've got two common wild species. And the third one, Erinaceus, is pretty common further south than Maine. And it's the one that's mostly cultivated around the world. And they look like an ice fall of teeth. When they're young, they're kind of short teeth. And at this age, they might even be a little pink. And then they turn pure white. And they're unmistakable, growing on wood, never on the ground. It's a great edible. Many people who are strict vegan or strict vegetarian love it as in taking place of seafood, a little bit of the texture and flavor.
It grows on dead wood or?
It grows on dead or dying wood, most commonly beech, birch, maple, kind of in that order. And this is what I find most frequently on beech, but also it can grow on birch and maple as well. And it can get big clusters sometimes. And you'll notice here, this one was up in Machias. And it was toward the end of October, and it was looking a little bedraggled. It was kind of reddish, it was old. That one I didn't take home, because as they start to it's been rained on a few times and they start to break down, you want to get them when they're young and fresh. And pretty commonly, yeah, if you're in the right turf, yeah. And this is the Americanum, the real coral-looking one, and it often fruits earlier in the season. So I found this, it was up in western Kennebec County, and it was growing out of a birch log, just a bunch of it. And this one I think has got the nicest flavor. And that was August. Usually they're a little bit further in the fall, September and October. I think we covered that already. And for medicinally, you can a lot of the early clinical trials were done with just dried powdered fruiting bodies. Some of the earlier clinical trials out of Japan. But so eating them fresh is good. One of that erinacine, herinaceones that stimulate nerve growth are alcohol soluble. So I do a double extraction tincture and have it for that. Yeah. But also pretty easy to cultivate, and you can get blocks of it to grow it from North Spore. Now, I was torn. Morels in the state of Maine are not very common. I know people who've been collecting wild mushrooms for decades and say, I've never found a wild morel here. But if you live in an area where there's any sweeter soil, either from glacial fill or from limestone, like around Rockport, Rockland, you're going to find them. It took me a long time to crack the code. I find morels every year. And across the country, it is the most commonly collected and eaten wild mushroom. You got them in Virginia, didn't you? Mm-hmm. Where? They're a spring mushroom. Spring here, Mother's Day to Father's Day. But if you start northern Georgia, up in the mountains there, they start, very end of February into early March, and then they kind of make their way north. I have found them, little tiny ones, the end of April. My goal is usually to have them by Mother's Day. That's the goal.
Now, is it common for morels to grow up where there's been fire?
Yes, and that,
When we found them the only time.
was that in Maine?
No, this was actually in Massachusetts.
Yeah. Yeah, and I used to always associate that with Western, but there was a big forest fire in Western Maine. And morels were collected for a couple of years after that. The fire, they have an odd ecology. They're partially saprobic, rotting things, and they're partially growing in symbiosis with trees. So after a fire, the theory is that the ones that are growing already with the roots have all this fresh dead tissue, and they just go crazy, and that sparks that flush. And there are people that have a lifestyle of following burn sites for morels. Yeah. So you can see here in the state of Maine, about the time the apples and the lilacs and the quince and the lily of the valley are fruiting, that's when the morels are fruiting. And they're really, You know, for years, there was this long, okay, how many species do we have? What's the genetic? And they have this plasticity, phenotypic plasticity, if you want to get really involved with words, where they can do a variety of forms. So on that left-hand photograph, the lower ones, all those morels came from the same big piece of property. The ones on the lower were under apple trees. The ones on the upper were either with white ash or with recently dead elm trees. And you would call them the same species. The ones on here that are nice, kind of longer and fine-boned were under elm trees near Augusta. And these ones were in an apple orchard over in western Knox County. And they're known for, they like old apple trees that are degrading for it, starting to go downhill. They like recently dead or dying elm trees. And I find them every year kind of growing in a symbiotic relationship with white ash. But they like sweet soil. So this was a good year. This was morels on Mother's Day. I was trying to get enough for Valley. Past 2 years, it's been too cold. And I didn't get them until later. And in a cold, wet summer, I have found them until the end of June in this area. But usually that Mother's Day to Father's Day. And they are equally as good and versatile and strongly flavored as black trumpets. And more precious in this area because we don't find them as often. Yeah. And if you have enough, if I get enough, I dry them for the future. I still have at least one more meal out of my stash. I try and use them up before the next ones start. Now here, in northern New England, what we have to be aware of is the false morel. The old-time mushroomers in the state of Maine used to collect these and they'd say, we call them morels. And they would cook them well and they would eat them. There's a danger. There is a compound in them called gyromitrin. Wasn't really identified until 1965-ish or so. And it turns in our bodies, it gets translated into hydrazine, a monomethyl hydrazine, which is really volatile, really carcinogenic, really toxic. And in Finland, where they love them, they give you instructions on how to properly prepare them. You put them in a large amount of water, like 5 times their volume of the mushrooms, cold water, and you bring them up to a boil for 5 to 15 minutes. Then you pour out that water and you fill it again with cold water and you boil them again for 5 to 15 minutes. And while you're boiling them, you make sure the ventilator's on high because the toxin is volatilized, and if you breathe it, you can get sick. And there's some recent studies, I just wrote a paper on this, connecting earlier poisonings with this mushroom to later development of ALS. I am not touching this mushroom.
Why do people bother?
Exactly. The why bother is my true thing. Yeah. They are higher in Finland. They are higher in Michigan, where this is common and commonly eaten. I was recently reading a paper there. There's several areas up in France and Switzerland, up in the Alps, where there are these small villages where this old habit of eating them, even though they're illegal for sale there, higher incidence of ALS. But it's all, it's not, we ate them last week and when we get ALS this week, it's longer term. So it's harder to really be clear about it. Yeah. But they're quite handsome. I find them every year, and I find them overlapping when the true morels are growing. In fact, here's a true morel, and about 300 yards, 200 yards away, this false morel was growing, and right closer by, that one in the middle, which is a different, pretty unusual false morel here, and very edible, it also grows. So anyway, be careful. All right, so I need to speed up a little bit. I'm going to dive into the puffballs. Puffballs are little globose-looking things where the entire inside turns into a mass of spores when it matures. We have a number of them here. We have big ones, the giant puffball. I'll show you a picture in a minute. We have some medium-sized ones, the purple spored puffball, and we've got a number of small, like this gem-studded puffball that grow mostly in the woods. They're saprobic. they've been eaten for years and they're pretty safe. So here's this typical, on that top right-hand slide, on the left-hand side of this picture, those pure white, firm couple of pictures, and then it gets a little more mature, starts to turn yellow, and the inside gets goopy. Another few days, and that inside is going to be purple and goopy, and no one's want to eat it. So you eat it when it's young and firm, and they are pretty tasty. I like them. And this pear-shaped puff or purple spored puffball typically gets up to 6-7 inches in diameter. And the giant puffball gets even larger. So this one was probably 11-12 inches, really firm. It's like tunking on a ripe watermelon, sounding hollow. It was in just perfect shape for food. And they grow mostly in fields or field edges, or sometimes in open woods. I'll show you in just a second. I often find them around horse pastures or cow pastures, that rich soil they really love. I found them in June, but typically it's like September here, August into October. That's Dashiell. I had an old photograph that he was so cute, but he convinced me I shouldn't use it anymore. So and this was in a field outside of Rockland, a field where I brought one of these into a woman who moved in with her son next door. And I knew she was a mushroomer. So I brought her a nice puffball. And when you do that to someone, particularly older folks, what you get back is stories, and lovely stories. And she told me, she says, 30 years ago, we used to collect them off Central Street. And I laughed at her. I said, the field up above that? That's where I got these ones from. Yeah. And so they're yummy. I don't have that photograph. You slice them up. You can fry them. And some people make lasagna noodles out of them and do it that way. You can chunk them up like tofu, except they've got a whole lot more flavor than tofu. And then, fry them up a little crisp. They're really nice, yeah. And the younger ones, pear-shaped puffball and the gem-studded puffball, so you cut them open top to bottom, and you make sure they're pure white on the inside. Because as they start to get yellow, they start to get bitter. You don't want to deal with that. And there's one group of these puffballs that I want you to be aware of and be cautious. Oops, I have to show you this first. The little puffballs are in the genus Lycoperdon, which roughly translated means wolf fart. And this is why it's called that. That little operculum opening on the top. Yeah. That's what we used to do with kids, right? We'd throw them at each other and kick them, yeah. And these, you've got a group of puffballs that generally, they're under 3 inches or so, occasionally bigger. They're tough. They're pigskin puffballs, earth balls. They're really, really hard. They've got a thick outer skin. And when you cut them open, from an early age, they're dark gray to almost black. And these are called the pigskin puffballs, earth balls. And apparently some people can eat these. Don't ever take them to your neighbors, because most people get sick within about 20 minutes of eating them. Yeah. And dogs, apparently, they've been killed eating those. There's something about the toxin in them that's really severe on dogs. Yeah. And there's a couple species, but they all have that thick outer skin and turn black, except when they're really, really young, you still got that thick ring, and they're quite hard, but they can start out white. So there's a bunch of other mushrooms that are commonly eaten. I'm gonna just talk about a couple. I'm gonna talk about the sulfur shelf or chicken of the woods, because so many people eat it. I urged people to start with caution. If this is not fully cooked, you get sick. And there's about, and I don't know, I've heard up to 10% of people, it just doesn't agree with them. I think it's closer to 5%. But I know people never been able to eat this mushroom. But it's a mushroom you can identify from 50 yards away because they're so brightly colored. They typically grow on wood. There's a related species that grows on the ground, kind of the same way that the hen of the woods does, but cream colored underneath and bright orange or to pink on top. Very distinctive. I eat it a lot. I like it when they're young, but go slow.
Yeah, we saw some of those on a tree, and we stopped and asked the guy if we could have them. He's like, well, you can eat them, you can take them if you want. I'm not touching them.
And that's the kind of guy you want to meet.
But, yeah.
So they does well. Yes, I love these. They do well in a stir fry because it keeps that color. That's just add a beautiful color to stir fry. Yeah. And everyone always asks me, well, what about those king boletes, those porcini, and those other boletes? There's all over out there. They take some learning. I do a day-long class on boletes. This is the book that I recommend for people if you're going to be studying boletes. It's huge. I love boletes. Some of my favorite mushrooms are boletes. But you have to do some learning because there's a few that will sicken you, including the only mushroom that ever sickened me. Was a lilac brown bolete in 1986, August 8th. I remember that day. But there's others. So this bicolor bolete on the left-hand side there, that's one of my favorite mushrooms. But there are some red, yellow pored, blue staining boletes that confuse it that sometimes sicken people. And this one, people mistake for the king bolete, the porcini, and it is nasty, nasty sickening. And this one here is so distinctive and so beautiful, that bubblegum pink cap and the red base of the stalk, nice edible. Nothing else looks like it. So, but be aware. And I got to throw in the meadow mushroom in that group because they're common, particularly some years. They're the closest relative to the supermarket mushrooms we get, and they're pretty nice. I like them. And when one of the common names from this is the pink bottom, and it starts out when they're really young, just opening that from that little ring, the veil. They have pink gills, and they go from pink to pinkish red, to reddish pink, to brown, to dark brown as they mature. Very distinctive.
You said they're the closest to what we get at the supermarket. What do you get from the supermarket then?
Well, in the supermarket, it's the same genus. It's Agaricus bisporus. In fact, the little button mushroom and the crimini and the portobello, they're all the same species, different variants and treated in different ways. Yeah. And the older they are, the browner the gills, the stronger the flavor. Just like that portobello has got rich flavor because it's a little more mature. Yeah. All right, we're going to finish up with some guidelines because everyone said, all right, where do I go from here? So I got 3 pages of guidelines that just kind of help to fill that in, and we're going to talk about some resources, and then we'll deal with some questions. So the first thing is, when you first start out, before you ever start collecting mushrooms for food, figure out how do you learn best? Buy and use some field guides, take a class, check out some of the more responsible websites, join a mushrooming club, and there is one mushrooming club in Maine called the Maine Mycological Association. I'm the current vice president, and I brought some membership applications if you want. It's really expensive. $12 a year for a family, $10 for an individual. And you get to hang out with a bunch of geeky people who love mushrooms. We do forays about every 2 weeks through the growing season, and we do a series of lectures through the winter. And the other thing you should do, if you can, find someone who lives in your area whose knowledge base and judgment you trust, and do whatever you can to make them smile when they see you coming. Bring them cookies or that nice, robust red wine. It's kind of chewy. Say, hey, if you come over and walk my woods with me, I'll make you dinner. What you don't do is say, hey, where do you find those morels? And where's your favorite fishing hole? Yeah. Because they can really help that learning curve immensely. And then when you start eating mushrooms, there we go. It's being stubborn today. It wasn't yesterday. When you first start, always make sure you cook your mushrooms. There are a few species that over time you can learn to eat small quantities raw, but in general, cooking helps us to digest them. And there are some things like morels and the chicken of the woods and bluets and a few others that are toxic when they're raw, and the heat of cooking makes them edible. When you're starting out, if you're collecting a bunch of mushrooms, you only eat one at a time. If you ate those 5 mushrooms you collected today and you got sick, you don't know which one did it, so you'll never eat any of those. So one at a time. And for me, I eat a little bit. I'm my own guinea pig. I don't share it with anybody else, particularly now, because I'm eating well beyond the Foolproof 4 if I'm trying new mushrooms. So I'll be your own test subject. And take good pictures, because if Poison Center needs to call me, the photographs are what I usually use. And if you're feeding them to somebody else, that fear of mushrooms, some people really have it. Make sure they know before they eat it that it's a wild forage mushroom and what it is. And if they say, I don't think so, then you say, great, more for me. There are some mushrooms I will take to a potluck dinner, but I always label what they are. And there's some mushrooms I wouldn't consider taking to a potluck dinner. And I've been doing this a long time, yeah. And then lastly, whoops. When you start collecting mushrooms, start slow. Start slow to stay safe. This is supposed to be the middle one. I was corresponding with someone recently who says, well, my wife and we keep a spreadsheet. Our goal is to eat as many different species as we possibly can. Man, and it's kind of like the longest life lives for a birder. Sooner or later, you're gonna run into trouble. You wanna make sure for food, you're only collecting from uncontaminated ground, not, railway right-of-ways, not, for heaven's sake, golf courses. Because the mushrooms can be contaminated by sprays and they can bioaccumulate, have some heavy metals and things. For identification, you want to collect all ages and stages, all parts. But for eating, you only want them when they're firm and prime or young. Avoid the old ones. And learn how to make sure you know to identification. If it's guild mushrooms, take spore prints. Learn your skills. And the bottom line is, and I have faced this many, many, many times, you never eat a mushroom unless you're sure about what it is and it's edible. I have probably composted more hundreds of pounds of mushrooms, just studying them and learning them than I can count. So make sure you know what you're eating. And then the final thing is, when you're out there collecting and using mushrooms, make sure you're having fun. Make sure you're having fun. All right, so that's where I've gone. I want to talk a little bit about books. I have some of the common field guides I recommend here, and there's a list of books here. Recognize, and there's also a list of some websites that I respect. MushroomExpert.com is a wonderful resource from around the country. Michael Kuo has a real firm stance. He doesn't talk about edibility. He doesn't talk about toxicity. He just won't go there. Although he has a book, did I bring that? Yeah. He also wrote a book called 100 Edible Mushrooms. So in his book, he does that. The iNaturalist is a great way to kind of track mushrooms and what's collected. And Michael Quebec, if you know French at all, is just an incredible resource. I don't know French well at all, but I use it. Probably one of the most common websites I'll use for help. And then Facebook pages. Don't trust Facebook particularly quickly for identification, but do track it for what's fruiting in your area. And over time, pretty much everything gets firmly identified, but the first 2 or 3 of the people that suggest it, they're not always right. So be cautious, it's crowdsourcing. And again, have fun. I've got copies of Chanterelle Dreams, Amanita Nightmares here. This is not a field guide, but it has chapters that go in depth on some of the foolproof mushrooms and some of the common toxic ones. A couple chapters on psychoactive mushrooms. Last chapter is on cultivation. I'm happy to part with as many of those as you'd like tonight. And I think that's it. This kind of the kind of things I do. I do a lot of day-long classes. and talks. I have a range of topics related to mushrooms. The 5-day seminar up at Eagle Hill, our mushroom camp, is the first week of August this year. And a couple of weekends, I'm doing one out on Hurricane Island, the end of August, and talking with a group in Western Maine again to do one out there. And probably working with North Spore in early mid-September on a weekend that they do. So that's me, and this is the group of nerdy folks that were at mushroom camp last year. We have had people ranging in age from age 11, girl who came with her mother, and her mother was quick to say, I came with her. She was one who's had interest. And we've had them up to age 94. So fun group.
Do you have a website that lists all the things that you do?
I don't, put a name and email. I send out a schedule generally at the beginning of the season. And I do post things on Facebook pretty regularly if you can stomach Facebook these days. It's still a connector. I'm starting to develop presence on Blue Sky, but it's going to take a while. Yeah. Questions?
Can you overpick an area and then they won't grow?
That's a great question, Terry. What happened, they've done a bunch of studies, and they've done mostly studies on those mycorrhizal mushrooms grow in symbiosis, and a lot of them are centered around chanterelles. And it started out in Central Europe because they saw the number of chanterelles being brought in were falling. And they said, who'd they blame? Damn mushroom pickers. But so they did a study, and they've repeated it in Western Oregon, and they take a forest, pretty even forest, and they have 3 plots. One, which is their control. They count how many chanterelles fruit every year. One where they cut the chanterelles off at the base to see how many come back, and one where they pluck them. And what they've learned is over the years, there's very little difference cutting or picking or plucking. The plucking ones actually increased in numbers a little bit, and where they cut, they dropped a little bit. But what's going to really make a difference is anything that harms the forest, either cutting the trees or really disturbing the leaf duff. So there's concerns about overpicking, and my basic way of approaching this, I never, ever, ever want to take all the mushrooms. And so, yeah, maybe at the most I might take is 2/3. I try and leave, and I get the middle-aged ones, I leave the youngest, and I leave the oldest. Yeah.
Can you also, I don't know what the timeline is, but because of the spores, is there anything you can do, like tap the mushroom, or is it not sporing? when you take it?
Some of them are definitely sporing. In fact, a lot of people who collect morels, they will put them in a net bag, and they'll, because they figure walking out of the forest, I'm going to be spreading a whole lot of spores, which is true. Yeah. Good question.
You're going into a new area that you've never been before. What do you do? Is there stuff that you look for, or do you walk around aimlessly like I do?
That's one of the better questions I've had in a while. What I do before I ever walk into those woods, I start to look at what are the trees. Because your forest tree dominance is going to tell you a whole lot about what mushrooms you're going to find. And if I'm hoping to find black trumpets, I'm going to be looking for the mix of trees that they're going to love. So that's the biggest piece of it. And if it's a little bit of a dry year, I'm going to look for shaded spots, north-facing slopes that are not too steep. So, and the Dash and I were up in the mountains, and we were going to climb to the top of this mountain, and we both got to this place where there was this really wide, gentle, down lower area that we said, oh, we're just gonna have to wander. So we probably spent the next 2 hours wandering way up this area, because your wandering habitat is the best way to do it. If you're one of those hikers that say, I'm gonna get to the top of that there mountain, you're gonna see less. You're gonna get to the top of the mountain, or you're gonna get the Appalachian Trail, but you're gonna see less. I have not. You can. There's ways of preparing it. You can leach out the ibotenic acid and muscimol by boiling. And there was a group out on the West Coast that were doing that a lot. I haven't. Yeah, that's the jack-o'-lantern mushroom I was telling you about, Omphalodus illudens.
Oh, that is the.
Yeah, and that, I don't think, there are a couple of species. There's a European one, Olearius, and there's a West Coast one. Yeah, there's several species, but all of them have that, it's a series of sesquiterpenes, which are pretty nasty on your GI. And I think cooking makes no difference.
I'm going about it in Australia, east coast of Australia. Well, it's not on the coast, it's inland.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure if they've got a different species in Australia. I know we've introduced a number of species from Europe into Australia and New Zealand, mycorrhizal. In fact, Amanita muscaria is considered invasive in those two continents. Yeah.
I have a question from Zoom, Greg. Sarah asked, can I dehydrate most species for preservation?
Yes, and you'll learn over time. Like I almost never dehydrate golden chanterelles because their texture when you rehydrate them doesn't do you any favors. But if I do dehydrate them, I will powder them because the flavor's still there. And I do that sometimes with black trumpets as well. I'll have a little jar of black trumpet powder that I use to flavor things. Yeah. Other things, you know, I always, if I have extra boletes, invariably I dry them because they enrich their flavor when they've been dried.
Naturally dried, you naturally dried or dehydrated?
When I was in New Mexico, I naturally dried them, but our humidity here is too high. No, I use a forced hot air temperature controlled dehydrator, and I usually set it between 115 and 125. Get much hotter than that. It's good for jerky, but it tends to denature some of the proteins in the mushrooms. Little things you never thought you knew, huh?
What did you mean by sweet soil?
That means it's low acidity or alkaline. You know, in the Midwest, there's all those morels out there because they have a calcareous, chalk-based soil that raises the pH, and so it's referred to generally as sweet soils. And sour soils, you get under all these conifer trees, the soils are a little bit more acidic. Yeah, and morels love sweet soil. You know, it's great when you ask that kind of question because I don't know what kind of jargon sometimes comes out of my mouth that doesn't get translated well. Yeah. All right. And I'm happy to hang around if there's any personal questions. Anything else on Facebook?
Kyle had one more. Any mushrooms that can or pickle well?
Oh, yeah. There's a number of people that pickle, you know, maitake, the head of the woods, gets so firm, and I would say sulfur shelf the same way. I don't think there are, and you would find online resources about which ones they pickle. The first time I ever ate much of the hen of the woods, my good friend Mark DiGirolamo, he grew up around Philadelphia, and his Italian grandmother used to go into the Philly market, the Italian market, and get these hen of the woods, and she would make nasca out of it, which was marinated with olive oil and vinegar and spices, and then she would can those. Yeah. All right, well, thank you very much. We're right about the time I thought we would need.